innocent men and women convicted and imprisoned. The estimates range from 3 to 10% of everyone locked up. In a country that puts millions behind bars, that's tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands falsely accused and imprisoned. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and those stats are unsettling. But the shock at so much injustice really sets in when you come face to face with the innocent people behind those numbers. And none more than David McCallum, who lost nearly 2/3 of his life to a crime he didn't commit. Imagine hitting these frantic New York streets after 29 years locked up. You confessed.
Yes.
A confession the Brooklyn DA now says was at best improperly induced, more likely coerced. You were beaten.
Yes, I was beaten by the officers.
16 years old.
16 years old.
David McCallum and his friend Willie Stuckey, two scared high school sophomores who didn't even know how to drive, confessing to carjacking, kidnapping, murder, because police allegedly told them they'd go home. That's what they told you, right?
Yes, exactly.
Just tell us what we want to hear,
yes,
and you can leave.
Yes.
And after a quick and dirty trial with a court-appointed lawyer he had met just once, who mounted next to no defense, McCallum, like Stuckey, was off to state prison. His friend would die of a heart attack 16 years in, but McCallum would remain confined for nearly 3 decades. Why would the police take 2 innocent kids and bludgeon them into saying that they did it and be happy putting them away?
Because they could, and they were probably pressured to solve the case.
The victim was a young white man from Queens. The accused, 2 even younger black boys who had barely been out of Bushwick. 16-year-old 10th graders with no idea why they'd been arrested until police told them they were guilty. A confession could make it all go away. Instead, it was 25 to life.
On October 27, 1985, when I went to the store, that was the last time I've been home.
The last time till last October, when Brooklyn DA Ken Thompson, 10 months on the job, said nothing tied McCallum to the crime except his false confession. A Supreme Court judge agreed McCallum was free after 29 years.
The election of Kenneth Thompson as District Attorney of Brooklyn. That's the miracle David had been waiting for.
But that miracle followed more than a decade of pro bono defense and advocacy. The work of a network that grew larger and more committed as the facts of David's story emerged.
David read an article in the Sun magazine that my dad had written about Reuben Hurricane Carter.
So David wrote to that author, Ken Klonsky. Ken, sold on David's innocence, reached out to Reuben Carter, who won his own exoneration after 20 years in Trenton prison. Carter, who knew of Oscar Michelin from an earlier case.
He asked me to get involved, and he sent me the transcripts, and I called him and I said, this guy did not get a fair trial. We had David, who was a model inmate.
So Oscar agreed to take the case, and it was a 10-year battle.
And just before his death last year, Carter brought new attention to the plight of David McCallum with this op-ed in the Daily News, what Carter called his dying wish. My single regret in life is that David McCallum of Brooklyn is still in prison.
And of course, Reuben was such an enormous presence and influence on this case, and David, I think, really gives him all due credit.
A case joined by Professor Laura Cohen and her students from the Criminal and Youth Justice Clinic at Rutgers Law School.
At that point, it was strictly parole advocacy, but very quickly, we became involved in the innocence side of the case as well.
Cohen, too, was convinced that an innocent kid, an adult under New York law, had been falsely convicted, but her parole petitions were repeatedly rejected.
The easiest way to get oneself out on parole is to acknowledge responsibility of one's guilt. And David, from day one, said to us, I will not do that. I refuse to do that.
No way in the world I was going to admit to something like that.
His pride and his integrity and the truth was more important than freedom to him. And that just speaks volume about the person he is.
It's what you hear about David again and again.
Like everyone who meets David, I was dumbfounded by his incredible poise, by his articulateness, and most important, by his absolute determination to prove his innocence.
It's what caused Ray Klonsky to make a film about David, a documentary meant to spread the word about an innocent middle-aged man, falsely convicted at 16, who lost 2/3 of his life to prison.
My name is David McCallum. I've been incarcerated since I was 16 years old for a crime I didn't commit.
But David now has his life back. Having taught himself some law while inside, now as a free man in the heart of Lower Manhattan, he has a job appropriately at Legal Aid. And he's learning all the things he'll need to know to make a life on the outside.
30 years from now, if someone asks me what is the most amazing thing that you have done as becoming a lawyer and as a practicing lawyer, I think I would most probably come back and say having worked on David McCallum's case.
A case that could not have been won without the virtual village that helped fight for David. But his case raises many more questions. Just what does it say about juvenile justice, coerced confessions, the nature of interrogation, post-conviction relief?
Not long ago, it would have been unthinkable. A U.S. president, a bipartisan group of senators, and law enforcement leaders from America's major cities, all of them urging a shift from the ongoing war on drugs to a new paradigm, a softened approach to drug crime. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King. Now under new scrutiny and attack, what the New York Times calls the harsh, counterproductive policies that have driven America's devastating prison boom, destroyed communities, written off an entire generation of young men of color. It's a movement that's been mounting, though it didn't fully catch public attention until Barack Obama went where no president had gone before.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I know this is the first time this has ever happened.
A dramatic way to underscore his call for meaningful criminal justice reform. A message he's carried from El Reno Federal Prison in Oklahoma to the NAACP conference in Philadelphia.
Over the last few decades, we've also locked up more and more nonviolent drug offenders than ever before for longer than ever before. In far too many cases, the punishment simply does not fit the crime.
And it wasn't just talk. Just one day earlier, he'd commuted the sentences of 46 federal inmates, all serving long, hard time for nonviolent drug crimes, most involving cocaine base or crack.
I believe these folks deserve their second chance.
The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 had reduced the disproportionate penalties for crack and powder cocaine, and more than 7,000 federal prisoners had their sentences reduced. But many of the Obama commutations involved the more prickly question of pre-2010 mandatory minimums.
We have to reconsider whether 20-year, 30-year life sentences for nonviolent crimes is the best way for us to solve these problems.
And though the president's freeing of just 46 may seem largely symbolic in view of the massive numbers imprisoned, the 6,000 later cleared by the Justice Department for early release will have wide impact. And it's only the beginning. The U.S. Sentencing Commission changed the guidelines again last year, and their retroactive effect could ultimately mean less time for as many as 46,000 federal inmates, nearly half of those in for drug crimes.
The United States will never be able to prosecute or incarcerate its way to becoming a safer nation.
It's what former Attorney General Eric Holder calls a sea change in the country's approach to drug crime and over-incarceration.
For far too long, our system has perpetuated a destructive cycle of poverty, of criminality, and of incarceration that has trapped countless people and weakened entire communities, particularly communities of color.
Like the old crack laws, the brunt of drug enforcement has largely fallen on low-income urban blacks and Latinos, too often policed, prosecuted, even sentenced more severely.
African Americans are more likely to be arrested. They are more likely to be sentenced to more time for the same crime.
But the crushing sentences born of mandatory minimums aren't limited to the black and brown. This white man from Bradley Beach found himself serving a 50-year state prison term for offenses involving not hard drugs, not violence or weapons, but growing and intending to sell marijuana.
Even correctional officers in prison, they couldn't believe there was actually a guy in there for growing weed with that much time.
And even the judge who sentenced him, bound by the mandatory minimums of New Jersey law, declared the sentence to be simply too severe and difficult to accept.
Even the judge himself felt that the sentencing wasn't appropriate or right for the crime.
The court was bound. It's the law. The law is the problem. He was bound to sentence Skip to this 50-year sentence.
He had just a 2-day trial, and a lawyer disbarred soon after. But his claims of ineffective counsel didn't get very far until Kelly Smith, a former public defender who just happened to be in the courtroom when Allegro was sentenced, signed on to fight for his release, or at least reduction, while Allegro went on serving hard time in the state's toughest prisons.
In Trenton, they jumped me in the yard. Some guys from a gang, just trying to earn their
Stripes?
Stripes, exactly.
And 5 years into his sentence, after split decisions on appeal, she was able to get him an all-important plea deal. In all, he served 7.5 years before freedom in 2010.
So he got a bum deal all the way around.
And Allegro says he met many like him, serving long terms in state prison, all because of state mandatory minimums, which, despite the advent of drug court for some,
I told you you're on trial every day, sir.
remain firmly in place here in New Jersey.
You know, 39 to 42% of our prison population is nonviolent drug offenders, which is the leading in the country.
And despite study commissions and calls for its end, most of the action has been in Washington, where a bipartisan group of senators, including Cory Booker, is pushing for reform of the mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug crime.
There are people that have been separated from their families for unnecessary amounts of years. This bill will address much of that.
It was all a part of the war on drugs, from Nixon's early push.
In March 1973, Richard Nixon authorized the formation of a new law enforcement super agency to fight drugs, the Drug Enforcement Administration.
Through Reagan and Bush 1.
The war on drugs will be hard won, neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, child by child.
With a ramp up from Bill Clinton.
Used to put 100,000 police officers on the street, a 20% increase. It will be used to build prisons to keep 100,000 violent criminals off the street.
But the drugs are still here. The prisons are packed with more than 2.2 million. Young lives are being ruined. And Obama's using his final months in office to say, enough.
For what we spend to keep everyone locked up for 1 year, we could eliminate tuition at every single one of our public colleges and universities.
$80 billion a year, 25% of the Justice Department budget, but it's the human cost that may be most troubling. As the president puts it, the United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. More than 2.2 million behind bars, a large percentage in for drug crimes, with blacks and Latinos disproportionately represented.
As a criminal defense lawyer, I've been inside jails and prisons countless times. I'm Raymond Brown, and every time I walk out the steel door, drive out the gate, I'm flooded with relief that I'm not the one locked up.
Now imagine you're in lockdown, not just imprisoned, but confined to a space not much bigger than your bathroom for 23 hours a day. I'm SANDRA King, and on this edition of Due Process, a new effort to do away with solitary confinement, a condition most of us know only from what we've seen on film and TV. solitary, the whole, segregation, isolation.
Chapman, how are you?
I'm in a cement box and people are screaming.
You needed a little time out to think about your behavior.
From the edgy TV of today to the classic Count of Monte Cristo, or closer to home,
Put this man in the hole. 90 days.
the Trenton-based tale of Hurricane Carter,
Away from me.
with Denzel depicting the hell of isolation. More extreme than what you'd find in New Jersey today? Most likely.
There is no such thing in the state of New Jersey. This is not Shawshank Redemption where the guy's locked in a box and somebody opens up the door 30 days later and the sunlight comes in.
But those who've been in solitary for months,
I only served 90 days in AdSeg, and it was horrible.
or for decades,
I was in isolation for 22 years.
insist it is still no less than cruel and unusual.
We locked down 22 hours one day and 24 hours the next day.
It's torture. It's torture in there.
Those charges are long-standing. What's new is the possibility of reform by legislation.
I'm here on behalf of the ACLU of New Jersey. I'm also here on behalf of a coalition of advocates seeking alternatives to isolated confinement here in New Jersey.
Appealing to a Senate committee to pass a bill that would mandate real change.
Recent studies have shown that isolated or restricted confinement has grave consequences. I want to thank you for listing this bill.
A bill intended not to end all isolation, but to limit, monitor, control, and contain, especially for the most vulnerable inmates.
Most notably among them are young people, developmentally disabled people, and people who are already mentally ill, whose mental illness is exacerbated by the conditions of confinement.
But can isolation create mental illness? We can't show you what solitary looks like in New Jersey. Corrections keeps us out. But the state of Maine allowed Frontline to see and film its isolation unit.
Friday night in the segregation unit at the Maine State Prison. All the inmates here are in solitary confinement.
The result, a vision of hell.
You know you gotta come out. There's a smart way to do this. This is not it.
Monsters. This is what they create in here, monsters. And then they drop you into society and tell you, go ahead, be a good boy.
New Jersey officials insist it's much different here.
In fact, we believe that isolated housing in a transitional sense doesn't exist in New Jersey.
Most of the abuse that take place in the prison solitary confinement.
And prison reform activists say if you aren't unhinged when you're put into solitary,
They flood their cells, and they cut themselves with razor blades.
you may be by the time you come out.
Some of them begin cutting themselves just to feel something. The mental health impact is awful.
I was going crazy in there.
Terrell Blount now works on inmate education and reentry. But at 19, he was convicted of robbery, sentenced to 6 years. A violation of prison rules put him in solitary.
Imagine being in this room for a week straight without any human contact, not speaking to anyone.
It's a grave injustice against humanity. It is a major social justice issue.
But the Department of Corrections tells a very different story, denying there's a problem,
I say that we are the national standard in New Jersey.
and insisting that passage of the bill
It would restrict the department from responding to ever-evolving trends across the field of corrections.
The deputy commissioner claims the current system includes safeguards and protections, time limits and reviews.
We ensure that the mission of our department, providing safe and secure correctional facilities for those who have been placed in our care, is never compromised.
Prompting this from the committee chair.
People describe horror stories about, people who are in solitary for years on end. I'm sure you're not in a good mental state after you've been in there for a while.
There's two ways you leave out of there. You either come out of there losing your mind, or you come out of there educated. How you doing, brother? How you doing?
For Barnes, that meant reading law, preparing for life on the outside as a paralegal.
Yeah, I heard, man, I heard.
For Ojiri Latulo,
They want to break me psychologically. So I knew my resolve had to be 110%.
it was creating collages like this one as part of a disciplined routine.
I would read, I would write, listen to the news on the radio.
Because solitary in this state has changed since Hurricane Carter was thrown in the hole.
I like your suit.
There are now radios, books, the chance to make art, and often even a roommate, which some say makes it tougher still.
It's very hard to be in a cell with an individual 24 hours, 7 days a week.
We can't say New Jersey's okay on this because we put 2 people in a cell at the same time. Because all the research that teaches us about the harms of solitary confinement tells us that the harms are equally applicable and sometimes worse when people are double bunked.
When I shared that cell with that other individual, it was very, intense. I felt like I always had to, watch my back in this very small space with another person whom I don't know.
Terrell Blount had come to Trenton to support the Lesniak bill.
This bill is trying to move forward on making better practices in solitary confinement.
These two are of the kind of cages you spent 22 years in.
But some of those who've been there say it doesn't go far enough.
I see the bill as a sham.
The bill is a joke. It doesn't address the real issue.
Solitary is torture, they say.
It's like being buried alive.
So anything less than shutting it down is not enough.
Eliminate solitary confinement altogether.
Still, some say it's a start.
And I think ultimately what we're going to get is a bill that's right, a bill that promotes public safety, promotes the safety of officers, and can save New Jersey money, all at the same time being more humane. Thank you.
And then there's the question of who's put in isolation. They're supposed to be the worst of the worst, those who spell danger for the institution, the guards, other inmates, themselves. Those who deserve either punishment or protection, for whom there is no other way. But former inmates claim it's also used to suppress controversial speech and ideas, or to punish infractions as small as stealing candy bars from the commissary.